Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Everyday Farmers Conference, all about getting started with small ruminants, which are goats and sheep. Today, we're just going to talk about the basics of what small ruminants are, what puts them in that category. We're going to talk a little bit about, just a tiny bit about their history, as well as sort of the trend we're seeing in with COVID and with some of it was declining for a little bit with small ruminants, and now we're seeing a little bit of an upturn. So we're going to talk all about that, and I have a wonderful speaker with me, Rachel White, and she and I are just going to discuss all about what small ruminants are. So Rachel, if you could just introduce yourself, and then we'll get on into the questions.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Rachel. I am in central Maine, and our farm is called Stone Grove Farm. We raise fin sheep and poultry, and I have a couple horses just for the fun of it. I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Maine, and I'm studying meningeal worm, which is a naturally occurring parasite in deer that does infect livestock. So that's where my interest lies, is sort of wildlife, livestock interface there. But really, I'm sort of a hobby farm, but we are growing in terms of like production for meat, wool, and breeding stock.
So how many sheep do you have?
So we just moved the entire farm. So we did downsize quite a bit. So currently we just have 7, but there are 2 ewes that are pregnant right now. We chose to do a fall lambing, which is the first time. So I'm curious to see how that worked. I didn't preg check them, so I'm not sure if they're entirely pregnant, but they look it.
How many have you had? Like, what's the highest number of sheep that you've had?
Oh, less than 20. I'll just say that. Less than 20, more than 10. Yeah.
And when you said you downsized, is that because of acreage or just by choice? Like, did you move?
No, so we moved, and it is actually a fair bit of field. It's 64 acres now. We came from a 100-acre farm before. But it's just the logistics. It's the time of year, winter is coming. Maine winters are very hard. And there was only one barn here, one run-in. So we're trying to still figure out the logistics of winter, and hay storage and all of that. So just reducing the numbers has helped. But it is sad. I treat all of my animals as my babies, so it's hard.
Yeah, well, I've heard that like the winter for animals I'm in Tennessee, so like the weather isn't too bad, but I know I've talked to some Canadian farmers, and they're like, yeah, winters are rough. So like if you don't know how your system and your setup is, like sometimes winters can be pretty brutal.
Right. And this is a whole new routine for us too. We have a 1,000-foot driveway that we have to plow. I'm like, okay, things have definitely changed. And having livestock on top of that is definitely interesting.
Well, you have a variety of different animals too, so that also throws in some logistical
right.
challenges.
Mm-hmm.
So let's get into just talking about what small ruminants are. So from like your educational background, if you had to explain to someone sort of the Wikipedia definition of what small ruminants are, how would you explain it to them?
Sure. Well, I'll begin with saying what a ruminant is. So a ruminant is a multi-chambered stomach animal. So like cows. And when we say small ruminant, we're thinking of sheep and goats. They have a 4-chambered stomach, and they are a little different than like camelids, like llamas and alpacas. They have a 3-chambered stomach. And they're also different than horses and rabbits, which are hind gut fermenters. They cannot regurgitate like a small ruminant. And pigs and humans are just a monochambered stomach. but we can vomit just like a goat. But they, sheep and goats, they regurgitate and then it passes through each chamber. So they do a really efficient job at converting, grass into a usable, like compostable poop.
And when you say regurgitate, that's like they eat it and then they throw it back up into their mouth and chew on it, and that's where you see the goats and the sheep.
Yeah.
And it's like
yeah, they're ruminating. Just like when we say, I'm going to ruminate on that, we're going to think and spend some time.
Which I think is really funny thinking about that term and using it, because I'm like, if you actually think about like the sheep and goat aspect, and like you use that term and you're like, oh, so you're throwing it back up in your mouth and chewing on it. Interesting.
Right.
So why is, because you mentioned the fact that like llamas have like 3 stomachs, and you said the sheep and the ruminants have, or the sheep and the goats have 4. But I don't think llamas are technically considered ruminants, correct? And that's, you said, because they don't regurgitate?
They can spit up at you. So there are people who, they're scared of alpacas or llamas because they might spit in your face. But, so I'll go through the stomachs. The sheep and goats have a rumen, reticulum, omasum, abomasum. And the camelids are missing the reticulum. So they're still passing the food on to the next stomach. It's just in a different way. And if you ever get a chance to look at a necropsy of an alpaca, they are alien-like on the inside. They really are. It's very, very interesting. They have like little pockets all over the place. They're a little different than like a rumen that you would find in a sheep or a goat. It's crazy.
Yeah, I was like, that's fascinating. Like, so it sounds like it's a similar process. If there's just that one particular thing that's in, is it in cows too?
So cows have a reticulum. They have 4 chambers as well.
Okay, so it would be cows, goats, and sheep, and that they all have that one. I'm never going to remember the name of what you just said, but the that particular
the reticulum.
Yes. Yeah. And so that's what kind of puts them all in the one category.
Yeah, they all, the camelids sort of evolved a little differently. So they just have a little more strange organ setup, I guess.
Yeah, that's all real. I'm not a chemistry or an anatomy person, at least not with animals. And so I'm like, this is also interesting because I didn't even know about that stuff. Let's go into talking a little bit about why people have sheep or goats, sort of their purpose. You can, I can jump in because I know for my respect, but what do you see kind of in your neck of the woods is kind of the reason why people have sheep and goats?
Sure. So here, there's no real large production system of sheep and goats. At one point, Maine was huge, had primarily sheep production. I mean, that was like the Civil War time, but that was a long time ago. So since those fields grew up, people moved on, and nowadays people seem to have just hobby farms. And that's sort of like myself. I mean, I started out with Nigerian dwarfs just for fun. I got 2 wethers, and they were just pets. And a lot of people seem to have the smaller goats and sheep for just pets. And then as people gain more experience, they, they might try, expanding to, well, I want to try milking, or I actually want to try spinning my own yarn. So yeah, around here, it's mostly hobby farms. There are some farms that do produce and sell like meat, and they sell their fiber. But I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah. So for our area, so I'm in Middle Tennessee, and so places I've seen is the most common are if it is something that people are producing for an income, it's usually for cheese. I don't think there probably is like a wool here too, but there's just not a lot of sheep or goats in the area. I know we have one goat dairy because we went and toured it. And I've heard of other cheese making areas, but sheep is not super common. I personally, we got our sheep for dairy purposes. Sheep milk is the only milk my stomach can handle. I've tried goat and cow, and for some reason, whatever protein is in cow and goat, it just doesn't sit well with me. So we actually have dairy sheep, which is really unique. Most people have never even heard of it. People are like, you can milk sheep? I'm like, well, technically you can milk anything, any mammal that has babies. Some things are harder than others.
Right.
Like I've heard of like donkey milk too. So I'm like, you can technically milk them. I just don't know how easy it is. And so for our purposes, we're planning to hopefully turn ours into a sheep dairy, because I want to do sheep's milk ice cream. So that's like the long-term goal. But for right now, it's just so that I can have access to dairy that doesn't upset my stomach. And that's very unique, I think, in most places. Most people do goats for milk. There's a few pockets here and there, but a lot of them are like homesteaders or, like you said, hobby farmers who are milking their sheep because it's a hobby. It's not something that they plan to produce for financial reasons. But yeah, so through this whole conference, I've interviewed so many people. They do multiple, meat, wool, and milk are kind of the primary reasons why people do go into sheep and goats. I've also seen, and this is kind of maybe a resurgence, kind of a trend, is a lot of people are going into it for heritage breeds. So they want to preserve a certain particular aspects of a certain breed, and so they really try to find a heritage breed that like really suits them and their purposes. And that's kind of another reason, is that preservation, kind of preserving these animals. I'm trying to think of what else. There's a lot of like products that you can get from these animals, and I think that's another plus too. The place we got our sheep from does cheese, but they also do sheep's milk caramel, which was delicious. And so like there's non-food products and food products that come from these animals, and I'm finding through interviews and just through my own experience that there's a lot more that you can do with these animals than a lot of people realize. They think a lot of them are just pets, and some are. But through just taking care of like sheep in particular, you have to, at least wool sheep, you have to shear them. And then you end up with all this extra wool. Like us, we're not going into wool, but we're going to have wool because you have to shear them. And like, I'm not going to do anything with it, but I'm going to share the wool with other people because they can use it. So there's definitely this really tight-knit community I'm finding. That's really sweet. I mean, everyone's just been really, really wonderful. And I'm seeing just more people interested in the small ruminants. And I think, everyone goes into it with different reasons. That's another big thing that I'm finding. I mean, what was your you had a lot of different animals. What was kind of your gateway animal? And kind of what drew you to sheep and goats kind of as a way to, obviously you're going to it for school, kind of seeing how those parasites affect livestock. So what kind of got you into that line?
Great question. Well, I have been animal crazy forever, and I've had horses forever, and I'm such a horse person that it was kind of a nice like segue, you know, going into like a different hooved animal. So when I got my goats, and then they had passed, and then I started college, and then ended up getting Angora goats, and I loved just handling the fiber and just playing with goats. And sheep have been recent. I think my husband and we thought long and hard about where we were going to be, what we were going to do, who we were going to be as consumers. So and we like to know where our food comes from. So, you know, we've been buying locally, but we know that we had the capability to keep a couple horses. Why not add some sheep? So we primarily got sheep for meat, and because we are meat eaters, we are hunters. So we started with four sheep that were pregnant, and it grew from there. And then now I've sort of become like a Finn sheep snob. Like I want to stick to this one breed. I think they're beautiful. I love their personalities. I love their size. I love that they're dual purpose. So they have beautiful fiber, but they have a very, very tasty meat. And sorry if you're a vegetarian or a vegan, but it's a big part of our lives. So we wanted to have a sustainable source that was close to home, that we could feed ourselves and our family, and maybe even sell some to people. And we have done that. So it's been a fun journey.
Do you do anything with their wool?
So I am terrible at spinning. I actually have bags and bags of wool right now, from the spring still, that we just, you know, we moved this year. I haven't had time to do anything with it. But I love felting. I absolutely love felting. I love knitting. So my plan is to send it off to a mill, to get it into roving and yarn. So I can actually start working with it now that winter's coming. So I'm like, that's usually when I start knitting. I'm not a year-round knitter.
Well, that makes sense because most people, at least during anywhere from like February to November, are either, well, at least for the milk side, you know, are milking, taking care of their animals, you know, making sure that there's no parasites, because parasites are a lot worse during summer. And then they have that downtime in winter. And I mean, downtime, you're still making sure that the animals are okay. But there's a lot more indoor time than during the summer,
Right.
especially where you guys are, where it's really cold. So
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit, because we talked about kind of the personal aspect of why people have sheep. Let's talk a little bit about what they do for the land that they're on, because I know for us, you know, like a lot of reasons that we have ducks and chickens, and you know, poop is amazing. We can have our poop discussion.
Yeah.
You know,
I love poop.
farmers love poop, because it just revitalizes our land and our property, and it, you know, the better you can get your soil, the better the plants are, and the better the plants are, the better the ruminants are for eating it. So let's kind of talk about, you know, maybe your experience with the different lands you've had. We've only had the one farm that we have now, but you said, you know, you moved. So you can kind of talk a little bit about, you know, what you guys had before, and then maybe what you have now, and kind of maybe how you're managing your animals, to make sure that you're using your land as best as possible.
Sure. So, like I said, I started out with horses, and horses are so destructive. They have upper and bottom teeth where they, you know, they get those roots, they get the grass roots, they destroy the grass. It becomes essentially like a dust bowl scenario. So, and their poop is really high in phosphorus. So it's just, the horses created such a terrible pasture setting. And I knew, I'm like, well, need to lime it, we need to fertilize it. So when we did get the sheep and when I had goats, we chose to do like a rotational method. So we shifted our entire way of grazing all of the animals. So the horses, the sheep, the chickens, they'd be rotated. And that really brought life to our fields. Another thing with horses is what they eat. If it's in seed, they will, that seed will go straight through them and they will actually like defecate a nice healthy seed. So if you are feeding hay that has weeds in it, that horse will potentially essentially plant those weeds in your field. Whereas a small ruminant, they will digest very, very well, and you are going to get out nice clean manure that will not grow anything that you don't want. So they're really, really awesome, productive digesters that will give you nice manure. So that being said, our fields went from just flat, gross, hard, compact, dry, nasty, they're just exercise pastures for the horses at this point, to really lush. And we did seed. We decided to, seed it to give it half a chance to, but they went from very, very just crappy and then and then to nice lush green fields. And at our old farm, we actually utilized the sheep to create new forested space. So there's a concept like Pasture that it's a system, you see it in Europe, I think more often, where you can actually fence in around trees that you are going to harvest for timber. So they sort of keep the understory cleared out. They're shaded, they're nice and cool, and you get like two products from that. You get your lumber and then you get your wool or meat from underneath it. So that's how we've sort of used our animals. I love poop. I'll say that again.
Are you planning to do a very similar system to the place you have now?
Yeah, so we went from a place that had probably, oh my gosh, only 10 acres of field and the rest was forest. In here we have about 20 acre of field, and they're overgrown with just woody shrubs right now. So thankfully we have a tractor and a bush hog to mow it when we've done some of that. But we are planning to rotate. I don't think the sheep will be as effective on the woodier stuff. So if I can convince my husband to get some goats, I might, because there is a difference. Sheep are grazers. They like the leafy grass, whereas goats like to browse. So like they'll get the up high woody stuff. They'll love raspberries, anything like that, which is what our fields are full of right now. They're not really suitable for grazing.
Yeah, I've heard there's a discussion of like, well, which one's better as a small ruminant? And it's like, from what I've heard, it really depends on what you have in your field. And because it's like they'll kind of eat some things that are very similar, but then they also eat things that are very different. So it's like, well, what are you trying to get rid of in your field?
Right.
And that kind of depends on which one's better. Because I know some people are like, sheep are amazing, just have sheep. I'm like, yeah, but if that's not the purpose, like if you have sheep out there still might be plants that they're not getting to because that's just not what they're drawn to. But then you have goats, and it's the same thing, is that they eat a lot of this, but they're still going to have some of that. I think that's why a lot of people will have both, because they'll attack different things.
Right.
Yeah.
But it is important to note, how they're similar. So we will have that health panel discussion soon. But you do have to be careful of poisonous plants because they often affect both sheep and goats. So that is one issue we have here and I'm glad we came during a growing season. We saw a ton of milkweed, and that's pretty toxic. So we'll probably have to mow, and that's just part of good pasture management anyway. So if you have more pasture than you have livestock head to keep it low, you're probably going to have to mow. So that's just part of it.
That's actually a really good point because I'm a city girl. I was born and raised in Orange County, California. So like this is all new for me, and this whole year I've been going around finding plants that I don't know. Like I just don't know what these plants are, and I have to do a lot of research. I think we found some pokeberries, um, which I also have a toddler, so it's like I have to make sure that
Oh yeah.
like some things are poisonous, some things that sheep aren't really attracted to, but then they look like blackberries, and so I have to make sure like my kid isn't like automatic. So it's like so I'm in this okay, is it okay for kids or is it okay for animals? Is it okay for both? Is it not okay for either? And I think
Yeah.
that's a really good point for people starting out with animals who maybe don't have that farming background, is to like make sure you know what's out in your field. Because our experience with our land is we moved into our place when I was 6 or 7 months pregnant with my first kid. Um, and so we had a new baby. We didn't really do anything with the field. We didn't have animals. We had come from an apartment. So we just didn't have time to really focus on the animal pastures. We barely had time to figure out the lawn, the lawn area. And so it took us a while. It was probably a year before we actually like realized, okay, everything's really overgrown and we need to like cut everything off. At least in one field. We'll start with one and then we'll move. We have like 4 different sections. So it's like we'll start with one so that when we get our lambs, that's how we started. We got babies. They had this section. And then we like started to move out. And so our main thing was, okay, just make sure the grass is low enough for them to be able to eat it. I didn't even think about like what kind of plants are out there. It was just, no, just do this. This is how we're going to get them. This is how we're going to manage them. And then we had to move the boy to the other pasture, and he broke into the others. And it was like, I have no idea what's out there. I like honestly didn't. And it was like, I just hope he's okay because I don't have, it's so overgrown. Like I can't even get back there to see what's back. And I think that's not the best way. It was one of those like, yeah, we probably should have done a little bit more research and like actually like walked out there and like really looked and saw what plants were out there. They've been out there for months. They haven't eaten anything that's caused any issues. So I'm like, okay, obviously things are good. We did have our soil tested, and the soil itself is supposed to be really good. But the area we have is also very rocky. There's actually, we've tried to put in fences and we can't get down into it. You have like that
right, we're the
like,
way.
and my husband will get like this far in and he can't get any further, and he's like, I can't keep it, like we can't do anything with that. We knew that when we moved, but we weren't planning to do sheep. We figured out the whole sheep thing like months after we moved. And so it was like, oh, okay, well that's an aspect of our property that just we have to cope with. My husband was like super frustrated, and I was like, every farmer is going to have something on their property that they have to deal with. Like you're never going to find a land that is absolutely perfect unless it was like you've been farming it for decades and they've really worked on it. You're going to find stuff, and it's just being aware of that and knowing going into it, that's what you're going to have to do. And like you with moving, like just because you kind of got familiar with the one property, it's like now we're in a different one. So it's like starting all over again.
Oh, I know. It's crazy. But it's also, there's something to be said about starting from scratch. You don't get all the parasites or cooties basically that someone else had maybe introduced. But if you're a first-time farmer and you have the opportunity to move on a place that already has your fences set up, that already has the barns, like good on you. That's a good find. I mean, it's precious, but but putting a little bit of elbow grease into making the system what you want it to be, there's value in that as well.
Yeah, and that's why we got our property. Is it was already fenced. It had 2 barns, a smaller one and then a bigger one that had like its own stalls and stuff. And it was like sometimes those are, I mean, there's so many aspects of buying property that like you have to go into, but we didn't because I didn't know at the time what to even look for or ask about. And I think we just ended up getting kind of lucky that there wasn't too much out there that was bad. And, but, everyone's going to have a different experience. And, that's kind of why we're talking about this, is just kind of being aware of some of the things to look for. Don't beat yourself up if something happens, because, there's going to be things that's missed. Just either you didn't see it, or, the animals themselves broke into an area they shouldn't have. And I think that's giving yourself a little grace, especially if you've never done it before. But even if you have, I mean, I've talked to farmers who've done it for decades, and they're like, yeah, stuff still stuff still happens.
It's part of the job.
Yeah. And it's like you learn from those, hopefully you can learn beforehand, but a lot of times with farming, you kind of learn from your mistakes, which is hard for people like me, who's like a perfectionist, and it's like I don't like the idea of making a mistake.
Yeah.
But then you also kind of go, okay, but that's kind of what you signed up for. So, because it's nature, it's just I think the phrase that's been used a lot in the interviews that I've been doing is, the animals don't read the textbooks that you read.
Right.
They're not on the same page sometimes. They're gonna do their own thing. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that was just it's really good. I think we're going back to their poop, but it's just really I was like, it's really good to know your soil, know your land, and kind of make sure that whatever you put your animals on is going to be beneficial for them. And I think you'd mentioned rotational grazing, and for anyone who doesn't really know what that means, you can correct me if I'm using a term wrong. It's basically you just make sure that there's small areas of your pasture that they're grazing, and then you just kind of move it just to make sure they're not overgrown. And I think from what I've heard, and this kind of goes into the health aspect, is that you don't want them to graze too long. And maybe you can correct me on this, because I read it somewhere and I was like, I wonder if that's true. Is that the parasites tend to be more prevalent, or more they're located more towards the shorter grass, and so if you overgraze, then the animals will get too close to the ground where all the bugs are, and that has a tendency to create more of the health issues. Is that correct? Is that it's better to have the longer grass for them to eat?
Yeah, definitely. Our rule of thumb is usually ankle deep. So once it gets grazed down to my ankle, then we'll move. But it's also, you're right about the parasites, but it's also, going back to the health of your pasture. If you are overgrazing that grass, if you're just killing the leaf that is keeping that plant alive over and over and over again, you're just killing it by cutting it down real short, you're not going to have a green pasture for very long.
Yeah, so even if you're preparing your property for animals, like, and you need to mow, like, just don't mow like down to here. Make sure that there's still quite a bit of grass for them to eat.
But there might be people who have systems too where you don't have enough land to rotate, and that's okay. I was like that at one point, and you're just going to have to supplement with more hay. Yeah. So the rotations, it's a lot of work, but it saves you a ton of money. It saves you a lot of feed cost. And if you actually have, a nice, rich, nutrient-packed grass, then you don't even have to grain, because your animals are just getting everything that they need. But I'm sure that's part of a different talk I think that you might have.
Well, I think that's a good point, though, because like some people think that they have to have like a perfect pasture, and it's like in a perfect system. And while we want to do rotational grazing right now, when we first started, we didn't have the ability to. We had a bunch of pastures, but the people who owned our property before us, kind of stole our gates. The gates weren't part of something that they were supposed to take, and then they took all of them. And we just didn't have the money to like put all the gates back in. So we did it for the one field, and then they kind of overgrazed. And so now they're in a different pasture because we were able to buy another gate. And the ducks and the chickens are all on the one so that they can kind of refertilize and do better with the place that they kind of overgrazed a little bit. But it's like you do what you can. You know, and it's, you know, I think you have long-term plans and then you have short-term goals. And sometimes like the short-term, that's just kind of what happens. So talking about long-term goals, let's talk about a little bit of the history of sheep and goats. Long-term. We're not going to get too deep into the history. I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about kind of sheep and goats are some of the first animals to ever be domesticated. They were found. There's been remains found in the Middle East, Europe, and Asia. So that's kind of where they I think were initially domesticated. And then as civilization started to move west, they expanded into Europe. And one of the things I found was really interesting is that it was the Spanish and the English who kind of brought sheep and goats over to the North America. I think one of the things I read even said that Christopher Columbus brought sheep over, which is so funny because the more I do research on food, just food history, you know, there's a lot of stuff in North America that wasn't here until the Europeans kind of brought it over. And it didn't even occur to me that that would be sheep and goats. I just was like, I guess I just assumed that they were always here. And then I was like, oh, wait, no, they actually were brought over. And then I've also been doing a little bit of research on American history. And I guess a lot of the founding fathers had sheep. I think a few of them had goats too. And so it, like sheep and goats were kind of pretty popular. I would say that they were probably on even ground with cows. I think the more people came west and you have the cowboys and they had more land, the cows just produced more food, produced more milk, and you had the land that they could just kind of go crazy on. And I'm noticing now that, because people don't have 160 acres of field anymore. Now they only have like a few acres for their own little property, that like people are kind of coming back to the smaller animals because, there's not these huge ranges anymore. But I think one of the things that something I had read was like the kind of start of the decline of the small ruminants was, I think it was either World War I or World War II, where they were like, mutton was like one of the things that was rationed, and like the soldiers when they came back home was like, I don't want any more mutton, I don't want any more sheep. They were like, we've had too much. And then that kind of brought in the cow, and I think there's advertisement that comes into play of building up I know I'm from California, so like happy cow or happy cheese comes from happy cows or whatever. Like I just grew up with those advertisements. I was like, oh, cow.
Good marketing.
Definitely. And bigger animals do produce more. You get more milk, you get more meat, but they also take up a lot more space. So people like me, I have 5.7 acres, and only about maybe a little over 4 of those is fenced in pasture. The rest is the house and like the yard. And so like we would be able to have maybe 1 or 2 cows versus sheep, where we could have, if we do the rotational grazing and really work at it, anywhere from like 15 to 30. And it's like, and that's like a big like kind of shift in your mindset, because I think at least growing up, it was always beef, steak. And maybe that's a cow. Like, I don't know if that's a everywhere thing, but I know that at least in California, it was all about cow and bacon, cows and pigs. And So there was definitely like, I'm seeing, at least growing up, it was all about the cow and the pig. And barbecue and all that stuff is all about those two animals. And as I'm getting older and I'm realizing how important the small ruminants are, um, I'm hoping that I'm seeing more of a shift back. What do you see? I mean, because I don't know where you grew up, um, but what's kind of been your experience growing up with seeing the trend in sheep and goats, or the no trend?
Sure. At first, I think it's, before I answer that, I think it's important to note culturally, um, goat is a huge source of protein in other nations. So it's like the number one food for many countries. So and the fact that that's not normal in the United States is sort of mind-blowing to like the rest of the world, because it is kind of the norm that sheep and goats are meat animals as well, and milk animals. So it's not just the mighty cow. Here in Maine, and me growing up, I never had it. I never heard of anyone eating mutton or goat. And then when I became a teenager and I met someone who raised some boar goats for meat, and I'm like, you eat goat? What? But until I actually I went to school and I learned about sustainable agriculture, and I learned about the cultural like ways of all around the world. It's so important to many people. I'm like, oh, okay, this makes sense. I should maybe try it. And I tried it and I really like it. And it's I don't know, it's more sustainable. I think they definitely have a smaller footprint than cows for sure. If you think of the traditional corn belt cow raising, where it's just the typical feedlot, what you're getting there versus organic raised beef or a small ruminant, whatever. That's up to you personally, but that's, for me growing up, it was the traditional grocery store beef, just like what you were saying, beef or chicken. So, and it's been interesting, like as a producer trying to sell our lamb, the past few years we've been so successful, and I don't know if it's a recent thing. I don't know if just more people are producing it and people are just, they wanted it in the first place, but there are a lot of people who really do like lamb. And so that's sort of, it's nice. So like here, it's still sort of like a niche, so we can be successful with it.
Yeah, I'm finding that at least with sheep and goats, there's still a lot of education that goes into whatever you're selling. People kind of know wool for sheep, and but even like the wool and stuff for goats, like there's just a lot of like holes I feel that I'm seeing in the general knowledge of what these animals can do. I was a little bit like you. We didn't really have lamb. It was too expensive where we were in California. Like just beef was cheaper. So that's what we did. But like ground lamb for like lamb burgers, we tried a few years ago because my family got into the sheep, and we were like, oh my gosh, like this is amazing. My husband still has the whole I like beef. And I'm like, okay, but you're gonna have to get used to sheep because that's what we have. But I actually like sheep a little bit more, but I don't know if it's more of a like I like it more. It's something else. It's something different. I have a lot of food restrictions. It's not just with the dairy. So about 80 to 90% of what most people can eat, I can't. And I was like, sometimes it's just nice to have something different. Like I've never really done goat, and even I have a meat discussion for the conference, and it was like really hard for me to find anybody who knew how to like, or was very openly was very open about like butchering a goat. Like, how do you do it? sheep was a little easier to find, but I was like, goat's really hard. And it was really interesting that you mentioned that like goat is like the primary meat in a lot of the world, because I was like, I can't even seem to find anyone who even does goat meat here. I'm sure they're out there, but it's a little less common and it's harder to find. And so I'm like, I don't know if I've ever had goat meat. Um, and it's a weird trend. Same with the sheep's milk. Like sheep's milk cheeses. I mean, there are a ton in France, a ton in New Zealand. Um, they do a lot with sheep. I see like people with hundreds and hundreds of sheep going over fields in Australia, and I'm like, what what happened? What happened to the U.S. where like it's completely, it's not opposite, but it's just different. Um, and it's so I'm like, yeah, I don't. It'd be really interesting to kind of delve into that kind of aspect of like what culturally happened here that was different than everywhere else. It's like maybe it was the cowboy, that whole idea of the cowboy and the cows. And I was like, well, I don't know, maybe that just kind of got in everybody's head. And so now farmers are, you're either producing like vegetables and fruit or something like that kind of farmer, or you're a cowboy. Like it's those two and nothing else. But I think, we talked about this, I think before, but it's like now we're seeing a bit of a back to the land aspect, people who grew up in cities going back to like having land and owning some animals. And what have you seen probably in the last, maybe even just during your schooling, is the trends happening now? Are you seeing an upturn, downturn? Has it changed since COVID? Like, was it kind of steady and then all of a sudden it dipped or dropped? Or what are you seeing?
So I don't know if it was always happening and I just never knew about it, but I do believe that, especially now with COVID, there's the back to the land movement, just like you said, is growing. I'd say over the past 5 years for sure, maybe 10 years, just the growth of people buying animals and just starting off as pets. That's huge. But I think just kind of like what my husband and I decided, we wanted to know where our food was coming from. So there's been a huge push for local small agriculture, just to reduce carbon footprint. I mean, Maine's a very environmentally friendly state. We really cherish our land. A lot of people cherish where their food comes from. A lot of people hunt for their meat. So it's almost sort of natural that people are becoming more and more aware and more supportive of not just like lamb meat or milk or wool, but just anything that a small local farm can provide.
Yeah, and what I'm seeing too is, so there's people like you who want to know where your food comes from and like want to be directly involved. And then there's other people who are like, I just don't want my food to go through 5 different places before it gets to my house. These people who are like, I don't want to farm, I don't want to have this, but I want to know like where it's coming from, and have it, I think they call it direct to farm, where I'm buying it from the farmer, because I don't want the meat to go from the meat, or the sheep to go from the sheep to the processor, to the packager, to, the storage unit or whatever, to the actual grocery store, to my home. Like when you actually see some of like the transport of these
carbon footprint is huge.
It's crazy.
It's stressful on the animal.
And I think that also is sort of a cultural trend too, where before it was, I'm going to eat the food that's in my community, because that's what's available, and there wasn't that like long-term storage option. So people, ate food when it was in season. They didn't have access to everything all the time. So, special things became special because, oh, we could only have this during summer, or we can only have this during winter. And now it's because of that, like, storage technology and travel. It's like, something from Florida can go all the way up to Washington, but it's still like, yeah, but it's still a day's travel. Like, it's still not like you're getting it the day if people picked it. So that flavor changes, the hormones are being injected so that they last longer. There's a lot of that kind of stuff that I think people were maybe not so much aware of, but now, maybe in the social community, online community, where that information is now coming out, and people are like, oh, okay. And then they start tasting things that came directly from farms and going, oh, why does this taste so much better? Why does this taste fresher? And it's like,
even an egg.
Yeah. Oh my God. So I have chickens and they have eggs, and I don't know if I really can taste the difference, but I know a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, farm, like, we sell some of our extra eggs and people are like, these are so much better than the store. And I'm like, really? But because I can't really tell. Once it's cooked and it's got enough salt on it, I was like, I honestly wouldn't be able to tell you, I think. Like, if you made me two, I was like, maybe I'd be able to tell that there's a difference, but I don't know if I'd be able to tell you which one's which.
Yeah.
But a lot of people have the higher palates and are able to tell. And I'm sure it is fresher. I just don't know that that particular aspect. But I was like, I do think, and especially with COVID, I've seen a lot of people when there was that food shortage, people going, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? I don't have food anymore. And it's like, well, there's food around. And you see a lot of farmers going, yeah, we sold out this year because people couldn't find it at the store. So they started to look to their communities, which I think is really, really great. Like, I love seeing that kind of awareness. I don't know if things were to get back to normal, if people just go back to the easy way, the thing that's a little more cheap. But I love seeing that turn, but I'm also seeing some cons to that turn too. One of the things is like food processing, having, if for our sheep, taking it to somewhere to get it processed. People are like, I think someone even said that they were booked out to 2022 or 2023.
Yeah.
And it was like, really? So for people starting out, that's a problem because we don't have time to we didn't know, and it's like, okay. And so now we're forced to kind of learn how to butcher our animals if that's what we have to do. And it's just kind of like, oh, that's something I didn't think about. So there's also I'm seeing some holes in shearing as well. There's certain people who will go to different farms and shear your sheep or your goats. And I'm finding even they're booked out for years. And so it's like they weren't quite, there's not this skill out there to compensate for that shift back. I don't know if that's similar where you guys are up in Maine. Do you see those kind of issues popping up where things are just being overbooked?
Definitely, for sure. I think, yeah, there's been actually a few newspaper articles about it. The butchers can't keep up.
We were just talking about kind of the effects of the increase in the small farming with the small ruminants and stuff, and seeing kind of a backlog of shears and meat. So I think you were going to talk about kind of what's going on with Maine and stuff like that.
Sure. So definitely with the pandemic, the need for butchers has increased, and there's been a few newspaper articles about it saying that they can't keep up with the work. So just like you were saying, farmers and small hobby farm, just enthusiasts, they have to be slaughtering their own animals, which is very hard. There's also been an issue, definitely for me personally, is finding grain, finding food. People have been growing their own chickens, whether it's laying hens or meat birds, but actually the shelves have been empty. We're just trying to find grain. So, making relationships, if you have like a grain farmer in your area, like become their best friend. We haven't had any issues like with shears, but veterinarians they're really hard to get also. They're usually booked like a month out. So having an emergency vet call can be very, very pricey if you can get one at all. So.
Yeah, that's a good point about the vets, because like, especially for people like me who do the milk, lambing and having babies is just a process, and you want to have that relationship with that vet, because sometimes they don't always have to come out. Sometimes they can walk you through what to do if there's an emergency, or just if you're new and you have no idea what you're doing. But like, that's what I've been hearing from a lot of the talks I've had too, is that like, make sure you have a good connection with your vet, just because you want to be able to text them a question if you have it. For us, when you were talking about shortage, we were using straw for bedding, and that was going out. Like, they just didn't have it. And I think when they started to get bad, we had already stocked up. Like, it wasn't like we planned it. We just had already bought some. And because our fields are all really lush right now, like, they haven't been going through the straw or the hay very quickly. So like, we weren't desperate, and people were like, you can use other things. But people were starting to garden a lot more. And so they were taking a lot of the straw for their gardens, which was like not in the animal livestock community. It's something else kind of needing its own thing. So it's like, not even just people who are getting into small ruminants, it's other groups that are like trying to get back to just farming. And I think that's something that like that this farming culture just wasn't quite ready for that drastic shift. I mean, no one was really ready for COVID, but it was definitely like, oh wow. I think it's a good thing to know that there's these holes, but it's also creating issues of like, well, what do we do about that? Because like you said, having to kill your own animals, like, a lot of people that they can't. It's too hard for them. I know even like our chickens, which we were kind of going into them for eggs anyway, but we're thinking about doing meat chickens. And I'm like, well, are you going to be able to take care of them when you need to? Because I don't know if I can. To my husband. And because I was like, I don't mind plucking the feathers, but I was like, I don't know if I can deal with the like killing. And that's for like small animals. And then you take the big animals and it's like, oh man, like I like that. Sometimes that's what I gotta do. But I also think that maybe, if there's more knowledge out there, then maybe people will start getting those butchering skills and start, making that more of a profession, so that there is more of them out there to kind of handle this upturn in the back to the land kind of movement. So we have talked a lot, and I know you have to go, but do you have any other last things that you want to share? Any maybe questions that you get a lot of that I didn't cover about small ruminants? Anyone who's like comes to your farm and goes, well, why do you do this? Or why do you have this? Just anything that just we didn't talk about.
Well, I'd say if you are looking to buy sheep or goats and you have no experience whatsoever, I would recommend finding a breeder, finding someone who has had raised them for a while, and just have a mentor, like learn the process of farming, learn the process of taking care of them, and the work that does go into them. It's not just a free ride. There is work. They're living animals. So, having a relationship. When I first got started with sheep, I met a lady who breeds this breed that I have, and we're still friends now. Like we talk all the time, and then getting into these groups, like whether it's a Facebook group or a local group, you know, the community is strong. They're really friendly. People love their small ruminants. People are excited to share all the facts, and you will get a lot of facts, a lot of opinions, but you need to figure out what works for your system. As far as questions that I get, it mostly has to do around the rotational grazing, like in our fencing with that. So they're like, oh, what is that net? It's like, oh, it's actually electrified. Please don't touch it.
Or try.
I don't ever get too many like care questions. Yeah. Now that I've learned, like, it's decked out with like warning electric right on the fence. So yeah. But no, this has been great. I'm excited to see what other videos you have, and I look forward to talking in the health panel.
Yeah, thank you so much for talking about the small ruminants with me today. Can you share how people can find you if they want to follow you, or just kind of keep an eye on your journey and your animals and stuff like that?
Yeah, so right now we're just on Facebook. If you look up Stone Grove Farm, 3 words. We did just move, so we really just downsized. We're focusing on our house. I'm focusing on my PhD. Within the next few years, when things sort of settle out, I'm hoping to start growing the farm again. But yeah, you can find me there. You can find all the cute lamb photos and what we're doing.
Yeah, because you said you're getting lamb soon, right? You're gonna do a fall lambing.
Yeah. I'm on lamb watch right now for one of my. She's a Finn Katahdin cross, so we'll see.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for talking with me. This has been so much fun. And we'll see you in another panel.
Okay, it's been great. Thank you.